I was trying to go deeper into this understanding of being a fighter. You had the war in Chechnya, and this is where the first so-called jihadi videos used to come out. These were the sorts of things that I was consuming at that time. And by watching these videos, I wanted to be in those videos. I wanted to replicate what I was watching. These people depicted as heroes.
Welcome everybody to the Going to Extremes podcast by the UNOCT Behavioral Insights Hub in Doha, Qatar. I'm your host, Dave Brundle. Going to Extremes is the podcast for everything you need to know about the latest in behavioral insights and its application to countering terrorism, violent extremism, and radicalization. It's here where we debunk the myths surrounding terrorism, dissect choices people make towards radicalization, and discuss how behavioral insights is applied to prevent violent extremism. This series takes you on a journey from radicalization to reintegration into society. Today's episode continues exploring the attraction in joining extremist groups and becoming radicalized to commit acts of terrorism. Leading the conversation is Doha's in-house BI specialist, Ken Reedy, who today is joined by Mubin Sheikh. Mubin brings his real-world experience of beginning his own journey down the extremist path, his eventual de-radicalization, to his current work as a counter-extremist specialist and practitioner. It's a great chat. I hope you enjoy it.
I'm Ken Reedy, and this is Going to Extremes. Today, our guest is Mubin Sheikh. Dear Mubin, welcome on board. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So Mubin, let's ease right into it. People get involved in terrorism for all sorts of reasons. And when you go through those case studies and you trace those pathways, etc., those reasons are not always immediately obvious or even logical. Like, if I said to you, I know someone who began his jihadist journey at a house party with a cigarette in one hand and a beer in the other, that just wouldn't make any immediate sense, right? People wouldn't believe me. But we know that guy. Why don't you start us off and tell us a little bit about him and this infamous party?
Wow, okay. So this was me at 18 years of age. It was my parents' house. It was one of the best house parties happening at the time. And there I was, cigarette in one hand, beer bottle in the other, and just having the time of my life. Until, of course, my uncle walked in through the door. My uncle was very angry. I remember him saying to me, Mubin, people pray in this house. They read Quran in this house. How can you bring this into this house? And I felt so bad and so guilty that I had committed, one of the greatest crimes and offenses that I could ever commit. And I think because of that shame and that guilt, it opened the door for me to become more receptive to extremist ideas after that. And so what I said was that I would become very religious now. And that is how I would salvage my reputation with the family and with the community. Tabligh Jamaat, that's the group that my father had grown up with, offered these immersion programs, if you will. 2 months to India, 2 months to Pakistan, where you would just live in the mosque, stay with fellow travelers, encourage people to come to the mosque. So I decided that I would put my name in to go for this 4-month trip to India and Pakistan.
And what happened when you got there?
Oh, funny you should ask. So in Pakistan, the Tabligh Jamaat sent us to Quetta. Now, Quetta at that time, in the middle of 1995, was also a place where the Taliban were very present. It was not even a secret. They were openly, everywhere you looked, you would see them. It was early in the afternoon, one of those days, and I was just walking around the local area. And as we were walking, I could see from the distance a number of individuals. And as I came close to them, I could see that these were not Tabligh Jamaat members.
How could you tell?
Well, they had weapons. That was the main thing.
That'll do it.
Of course, they had their turbans and their robes, but they also had their weapons: AK-47, rocket-propelled grenade, belts of ammunition. And so that really intrigued me. And I would approach them and I would talk to them. And that's when I would be, I've used the term before, bit by the jihadi bug. And that's where I started to become more interested in the group. For me, that would be the beginning of a journey that would take me into, more extremist groups.
So you go back to Toronto. It must feel pretty strange to go back there. You have a whole different mission plan for yourself. What did you do?
Well, when I returned back, of course, I had fully indoctrinated myself, in the Tabligh Jamaat worldview with, of course, a fixation on the Taliban. So one of the things that I did is I began to dress like them. So I started to wear the black turban. I had a big beard. I had robes. And so this is how I started to dress and look. And it was a complete sharp shift from what I was previously. The Taliban, I had a brief conversation with them while we were there about their worldview and how they look at things. And their whole thing was, jihad fi sabilillah. If you want to raise the dignity and the honor of Muslims once again, you can only do so through jihad fi sabilillah. And so this later became like the core jihadist doctrine, if you will, that everything had to be funneled or focused through the prism of being a militant. I would end up leaving the Tabligh Jamaat because the Tabligh Jamaat were not interested in my new ideas. So I ended up leaving the Tabligh Jamaat and found myself walking into a local, you can say they're like a Salafi, group. And it was from there that things went even further because I was trying to go deeper into this understanding of, jihad fi sabilillah and being a fighter. So you had the war in Chechnya. And so from then, this is where the first so-called jihadi videos used to come out. These were the sorts of things that I was consuming at that time. And by watching these videos, I wanted to be in those videos, right? I wanted to replicate what I was watching.
Yeah.
These people, they were depicted as heroes. And so just seeing these, these people, and here they were doing the jihad that I was hearing about. And now I'm seeing the jihad. And so now I want to be a part of that jihad. Then actually in 1998, I got married. And so that, I think what that did was that slowed me down a little bit. We went to Medina, then we went to Mecca, and we did the Holy Land tour, and we visited all these different places. And you see what this is doing inside is it was giving me more exposure to other cultures and other religions and other history. So this started to open my perspectives a little bit. I didn't know at the time what was happening. I know now what I went through. It was 9/11 a few years later that made me think to myself, wait a second, I need to rethink, all this jihad stuff and wanting to be a mujahid and so on. I heard on the radio that a plane hit the building. And honestly, the first words that came out of my mouth, Allahu Akbar. Now, when you say Allahu Akbar, it can mean two things. It can mean, all right, yes, Allahu Akbar. Or, oh no, Allahu Akbar. And I'll be honest, I was feeling both. I was supposed to hate America. I was supposed to hate the West. Even though I'm born and raised in the West, I did not like the idea of, flying planes into buildings. This I did not consider to be jihad. This was not something that I read anywhere that I could understand was legitimate. So when this happened, obviously I said, okay, you know what? I don't know enough about Islam. So I decided that I would do that. And I decided that I would move to Syria and I would stay there and live there to study Arabic, Islamic studies. In 2003, the war in Iraq started. And even I saw with my own eyes that the Syrian government was sending, people to go and fight. More things started to happen. People started to, especially Westerners, became very radicalized because of the war in Iraq. A lot of pressure came onto the Western students that were there, especially people who looked like me. Big beard, black turban, Taliban turban. And so really there were a number of things that happened at the time. I was just getting fed up of the place. I was starting to miss my home. I wanted to go back. But the main thing was that the time that I spent there, the wonderful shuyukh that I met while I was there, who taught me the real meaning of Islam and the real meaning of jihad. And we went through the Quran, and we studied the Sunnah, and we studied the Seerah, and we studied the Tarikh, the history of Islam. And it was a very chronological way to study the Islamic sources. So I was done in 2004, and I went back home to Canada.
And you said shiyukh, so that's the plural of sheikh, right? So there were numerous sheikhs there taking you through this. Was there anyone in particular that you bonded with, or was it all of them?
No, there was one that I bonded with in particular. It was the sheikh of tafsir that I bonded with.
And tell me, are you still in touch with that sheikh?
No, I don't know. I don't know what happened with him. I lost track. I mean, once I came back, things changed, and never heard from him again. So in 2004, I come back from Syria. The first week that I'm back, the first Canadian has been arrested on terrorism charges. Mubin Sheikh was his name. He was arrested in connection with the 2004 London fertilizer bomb plot. Mubin Sheikh was my childhood friend.
Oh, no way.
So I ended up contacting the Canadian Security Intelligence Service to basically give a character reference. I had reached out to the intelligence service. The intelligence service basically came, talked to me, interviewed me, recruited me to be an undercover for them, where I would then infiltrate into password-protected chat forums online, as well as human networks on the ground. So people that we had to go and get information on. So I did that for some time. In 2006, 18 individuals were arrested on terrorism charges. At the end of it, 11 people were eventually found guilty of terrorism-related offenses. 2011, the war in Syria starts. Now people were talking about going to join the fight. So I was on Twitter, I was on Facebook, I started to see all this stuff. Then we started to see the rise of ISIS by 2013. And then the attacks started in the West, in France, and at the end of 2014. And then 15, 16, 17, the attacks increased in different countries. And this is where the whole topic of really de-radicalization, and it really came back to the forefront, because now there were people who wanted to come back to their home countries. There were people who, there was a lot of activity from diplomatic organizations and other NGOs to work on some of those people who were in custody and are still in custody, in those places. So that's the full spectrum of experiences.
Let's wheel back a little bit and unpack the specifics. Doing a sort of superficial analysis, in terms of radicalization, you met the Taliban, and you're very young, you're coming of age, and you framed in your own mind the Taliban as maybe the epitome of masculinity, people to emulate. You want to be in the videos as well. It's actually a rather romantic notion in the French sense. And when it came to your de-radicalization, it was that benevolent sheikh who specialized in tafsir. What's your take on that? That actual person-to-person role modeling, looking up, please.
So there's two ways to look at this. I think obviously the social and behavioral scientist is going to look at those observable, measurable traits and activities. Why does a person even want to be influenced in that way? You have to ask yourself, like, what is it that makes a kid look at a video and think, I want to be in that video. I want to be that guy. So you can break it down to that inner quest for significance, meaning and belonging, something that I am doing that I feel is important. I feel it's adding value. It's doing something good. And you don't want to do it by yourself. You want to do it with your friends.
Yeah.
And it's very, very common. And I mean, you know this, that in many, many cases, individuals who go, whether it's going to join ISIS or join this, or in the case of Ukraine foreign fighters, it's the same thing. I want to go with my buddies.
Yeah.
I want to experience what they're experiencing, and I want to do it in a shared manner. So socialization is, I think, is the other side of the coin. I would put ideology on one side of it, and I would put the socialization on the other side.
Let's take that further, right? That perception of religion. Have you ever heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Yes.
I'm sure you know it, but for those who don't, it's when people with limited knowledge in a particular domain, like let's say Islam, when they overestimate their knowledge and become very sure of that little bit that they actually know. So it just sounds to me like, when you had that wonderful time with the shiur and they taught you more, the more you knew, the more able you were to actually begin to question things and then, act accordingly.
Yeah, well, whether it's Dunning-Kruger or just being a teenager.
True.
Right? If you think about it, at the pubescent point is when the prefrontal cortex starts to activate. Okay, it's not fully developed.
Right.
It starts to activate. It's like basically like like when a calf or a deer is just born, from its mother. It gets wobbly in the beginning, blah, 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 but within 20 minutes, it's already running up and down the field.
Yeah.
Right? So that's their stages of development for the deer or whatever it is, right? We're obviously not like that. When we come out, we don't learn to walk. It takes us a whole year.
Yeah.
But you can see how in the beginning, you're starting to use the skills that you have. Okay? So this is what happens with young people, especially, where they've started to pick up some things about religion, or politics, or religion and politics and whatever else. And that's it. Now you figured everything out. And believe me, I was definitely that kid at 19 years old, 18 years old, even 17 years old. I was arguing with my dad about all sorts of stuff, politics, this, that, and whatever. So yeah, it does. The way in which you start to see these things is, of course, but when you actually get to a point where you're more mature, that's when you actually start to learn.
And the timing there is fascinating because when you look at the actual maturing of the prefrontal cortex, it's in your mid-20s.
Yeah. And
just looking at your timeline, that's when you were in Syria. You're actually most able to absorb that which you're actually hearing, So the age-wise, it was absolutely perfect. What I want to do now is just go back a little bit further, back to that house party. I know I can't really get away from it. You framed it as guilt. You felt guilt. You felt shame. You caused offense. Maybe you want to frame it as a product of hedonism or decadence or just being a teenager. Beginning your radical journey at a house party isn't really an anomaly at all. So, and let me just explain that, because during the heyday of Daesh, framing radicalization as a means of atoning for sins was quite common, In fact, guilt and shame were almost used as recruitment mechanisms to great effect. So tell us, as a current practitioner, as a former and as a former operative, what are your thoughts on that? Having seen this also happen in like France, we had a number of case studies where this was quite frequent.
So I've had my own anecdotal experience.
Yeah.
I've seen it as an undercover, and I also saw it online during the ISIS heydays. And this idea of guilt and weaponizing guilt and weaponizing shame, and we saw this all the time in ISIS recruiting stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I'll never forget one, how they would mock fellow Westerners, saying that, look at you sitting at home eating those chicken wings, I still have the screenshot of he's like, put down the chicken wings, bro, and come to jihad. You're tasting something that, you're missing it. It's the great stuff up here, the 5-star jihad. So they know this. The recruiters knew that. And this was definitely a common theme that you find in this sort of stuff, where especially that religion provides that guilt, makes you feel so bad that you've done something so heinous.
Yeah.
Look, I don't consider a house party that heinous.
I don't want to take up too much of your time. So what I'm going to do is just end with these quick fire questions, right? So these quick fire questions, some of them are kind of unfair, but you're in the hot seat.
Okay, let's go.
Let's do it. Question number 1. Can we profile terrorists?
Yes.
Ooh, okay.
Behavior profiling.
Question number 2. Can anyone become a terrorist?
Of course.
Question number 3. What's the most pressing issue you think we should be addressing right now when it comes to CT and PCV?
Prosecuting people who have committed those crimes so that others can see this is what happens when you do these things.
What are some of the factors that I would notice in my son or daughter that should make a parent like me call a practitioner like you?
Wow. Okay. Sharp, sudden shift in behavior. Sometimes ideology and behavior. Meaning sudden and sharp shift means not just being argumentative and being whatever, but openly displaying symbols of extremist organizations. That's a major, major red flag.
Yeah.
Deceiving the parents of associations and practices that they may be engaged in. Suspicious travel or financial transactions.
Okay.
Or attempts to because even searching on a computer, like, traveling to Turkey.
Yeah.
It's like, why are you traveling to Turkey? You've been talking about how the world is going to hell and I'm a mujahid, and now you're telling me you want to go to Turkey for tourism?
Yeah. What about things like us and them thinking? Like, this is a thing people tend to notice where suddenly, your son or daughter is suddenly having, these guys are bad guys, these are good guys, that sort of thing, which they never had before. Is that common?
It's very common. Look, I think in many Islamic, even mainstream Islamic understandings, people have this very black and white thinking. It's Muslim and non-Muslim, and that's not good. I've told, as I tell young Muslims that I deal with who are radicalized and who have these exact same ideas that, they're kuffar. Oh, I go to school and all the kuffar at my school. I'm like, bro, they're 17, 18, 16, 15. It's a high school. They're kids.
Yeah.
They don't know anything about their life and their religion, this and that. Don't just call them kuffar.
Yeah.
You should probably call them not yet Muslim.
Yeah.
Right? You don't know if they have rejected your Islam. I mean, you have to take a softer approach to people. Yeah. So that's how I would respond to them. But definitely having that black and white thinking.
Yeah.
You don't want to look at just one thing. It's usually never just one thing. Like, okay, obviously your kid has an ISIS flag or a neo-Nazi symbol or something. That is a single, warning sign that you can go with.
Yeah.
But for example, somebody who suddenly becomes very religious, whether very Christian, very Jewish, very Muslim.
Yeah.
And the kid doesn't come from a Muslim family. That is not extremism. That's just religiosity.
Yeah.
But if you add that increased religiosity with hate rhetoric, well, then now you can see that, that sudden change in dress is not just about religion. There's an ideology attached to it.
Yeah.
So what parents need to look for, others, educators, or whatever else, there are usually clusters of behaviors, 2 or 3 that when you add them together, they become worrisome.
Yeah.
Some that are standalone that are very worrisome.
In your opinion, are we countering contemporary terrorism with yesterday's tools and knowledge? Is what I meant.
Well, if it's a yes and no, then I would just say no.
Okay,
right?
good.
I want to say that it's not all in vain. I mean, we have learned a lot of good things. And we've gone through this whole, 20 plus years of the so-called war on terror.
Yeah.
And it's just worse 20 years after.
Yep.
There's even more. I mean, if you look at how many members Al-Qaeda had before 9/11 compared to how many they have now, it's like, it's huge difference. So we are doing a number of things wrong, but I think there are some things that are being done right, which we need to do more of.
Like what?
Accessing NGO expertise.
Yeah. Okay.
Understanding that it is not going to be dealt with through a security paradigm.
Yeah.
In fact, it will require a public health paradigm. That's the way in which we are going to do it. We did the securitized thing for 20 plus years. I come from that background too.
Yeah.
I'm still a big believer in undercover operations and going after those people who need to be chased. But, the 17-year-old kid, the 15-year-old kid, do we really need to spend millions of dollars on counterterrorism investigations for these people?
Right.
I don't think so. I think we need to put that support and funding and whatever else into NGOs who can deal with those young people on their terms.
Are there any myths about radicalization we haven't mentioned yet that you'd like to dispel for our listeners?
I think I used to say this as a joke that radicalization is not just a condition that affects brown people. If the ingredients are there, the radicalization will follow. It doesn't matter what the background is, what country, what religion, what ethnicity, what gender. If the ingredients are there, the end result is going to be the same.
Where do you think we should be putting most of our time, resources, and knowledge? Into decreasing risk factors or into increasing protective factors?
It's kind of an easy question. Increasing protective factors is the easy answer.
I thought when you were discussing the NGO, I was like, he's probably going to go that way, but I'll ask one question in between and see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it is a better way because that is, you can spread that out a lot easier. Risk factors are a little more difficult to talk about.
Yeah.
As if you put it into protective factors, civic engagement, sports engagement and involvement, sports training, vocational training.
Yeah.
You don't even have to use the word radicalization or extremism.
That's what's great about it. Yeah. The problem with it is it also blurs the lines. Like some NGOs say, now we're in...
Blur the lines. Go ahead.
I suppose, yeah.
Blur away. Because the problem that you're dealing with is so bad.
Yeah.
We're, terrorism, extremism. The end result is something that is so terrible. That's okay if you blur the lines in this, what are you doing? You're doing good. Developing protective factors, enhancing those things. Those are good things. Those are good activities that everybody can participate in. So
I think,
let it blur. It's fine.
I think blur away is a great way to end this. Mubin Sheikh, thank you for your time and sharing what you know with us.
Thanks for having me. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all.
Going to Extremes is produced in Doha, Qatar, by the International Hub for Behavioral Insights to Counter-Terrorism. This series is a product of the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism. The information and opinions presented in this podcast by the guest speakers are those of the speakers. They do not purport to reflect the opinion or views of the UNOCT, the United Nations, or any of its affiliated organizations. For more information, visit our website, un.org/counterterrorism. You can follow us on Twitter using the handle @UN_OCT. And join the conversation using the hashtag #GoingToExtremes.